Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike. I'm an IT lecturer at Milton Keynes College. I've been in further education now this is my 10th year, spending the bulk of it at Aylesbury College, 7 or 8 years. They all kind of merge into one after a while. And now, obviously, at Milton Keynes College, I predominantly do things like web design and Photoshop and creative stuff like that. I quite enjoy doing. But today I'd like to discuss something else, which is called philosophical inquiry. And I think it's quite a fancy name for something, a concept which is actually quite straightforward, really. So first of all, before we actually kind of look into what philosophical inquiry is, I just want to discuss a couple of bits. The majority of this is my opinion, okay, so I'm sure if you wanted to, you could find some stats to either prove or disprove any of this, okay. But this is certainly something that I've been coming across as a tutor over all these years. It doesn't really matter what level I'm teaching on. When we actually see some of this stuff, it's more quite ingrained, really, by the time that students reach further education. Some of this stuff has been going on throughout their lives. So, one of the biggest issue is that students are continually assessed and graded against a very specific set of criteria, and that is what we're all graded on. It's has the student met that criteria? Yes, no. Okay, well, if not, why not? It must meet that criteria, and ultimately that is the be all and end all in a lot of cases, and so therefore there tends to be not a lot outside of that criteria, because actually, does it really matter? I mean, we don't know, but actually we know as teachers that actually there's a whole lot of other skills outside of these criteria that actually matter a whole lot for life experiences, let alone just to pass their course or not. So I think this point is a big issue. So for pretty much their whole education, they've either been branded a success for reaching a certain level or a failure because they haven't reached a certain level. I mean, you take the English and the maths as an example. If you're a grade 3, you're a failure, whereas if you're a grade 4, you're a success, which I think is it just doesn't make sense, because actually the difference between a 3 and a 4 is not very big. You might be a high 3 and a low 4, and the difference will only be a handful of marks, and yet in the grand scheme of things, one is a success and the other is a failure, which is bizarre. But that is what we have in our system, unfortunately. And I think, especially in FE, I find we have insufficient time to actually learn, or for students to learn the topics inside out, because let's say, for example, I'm teaching web design, and I have the criteria for the level 3 web design for OCR on the screen now. They've got to do all of that criteria in 10 weeks or 12 weeks, whatever it might be. Either way, it's just not enough. And you've got all of those 10 criteria there, so effectively they've got to hit one criteria a week. And then you've got your P5 criteria, which is to create an interactive website to meet a client need. But I can tell you, as a web developer, actually, if you're going to make a interactive website properly, you're going to need a few weeks, maybe running into months, to do that thing properly. And yet here you are, giving students this thing to, you've got to learn this and you've got to do this within X amount of time, but actually there's not enough time to learn it properly anyway. I think this is an issue, because ultimately if they don't pass these criteria, they don't pass the course, and that's what kind of prevents us from going into what they kind of ask us to do wouldn't cut it in the real world. That they need to learn it, and they need to do more. And if they don't do it, they tend to find a source from Google, and they don't then think about, is that source suitable? I've had numerous students reverting to using things like prezzies from other students, and you say to the students, to my students, okay, well, who is that person that has created that prezzy? And they don't know. and you say to them, okay, well, how do you know if that's even accurate? How do you know if they pass that criteria? They don't know this, and that they still will use that as a basis for their work. And it's quite frustrating, because actually there is something that students should be able to learn this thing properly. They should be able to meet this criteria properly, not just reciting stuff that they've found from sources, because actually that isn't learning. And it's tough. So we have got more parts than this. So obviously you've got students being continually assessed from a young age, and it's far worse than when I was a kid. I mean, I remember when I was at school, we had SATs in one of the primary school years. I can't remember which. Does that roughly show how old I am? But these guys are continually assessed year in, year out these days, until they get to a point whereby they reach us. And let's say that I say us as in FE, and let's say, for example, they've been told that they're failure from whatever age because they've not been meeting their academic standards, and then all of a sudden we're expecting them to turn around, and it's just it's not going to happen. You've got to build up from the bottom, almost a confidence thing, I suppose you could say. But being consistently assessed is going to get you into this thing whereby you know that you have to meet this assessment criteria, but actually the stuff outside of it doesn't really matter, which isn't the case, because in the real world you don't really get graded against assessment criteria. You get told to do a job, and I guess you could make an argument for that being some kind of assessment criteria, but it's not, let's be honest. Schools and colleges are graded against that as well. That makes us under an awful lot of pressure, but actually one of the issues I find with these is that obviously the targets have been set by the government and bigwigs up above, and they understand stats. They don't understand about learning. And let's say, for example, in a vocational course, let's say a level 2 vocational course, you're expected to get 90% of your students through, and I've got 50 students. So let's say I'm expected to get 90. 90 is quite low, actually. It's usually higher up than that. That means we can fail 3 or 4 of them off the top of my head. No, yeah, 3 or 4 of them. Let's say 3 or 4. Well, actually, that's not very many. And when you go through the course of year, actually, probably more of them should not pass that course. And you want all of them to pass. Okay, let's not beat around the bush. You want all of them to pass, but in reality, let's say, for example, you have a student that's missed the deadline. Well, that student should fail. Okay, but the schools and the colleges are forced to try and find ways around this, because their target grades and their target success is so high that we are kind of put under pressure, and it's come from way up high, and it is an issue, really. Ken Robinson, I think this is probably one quote I've got in here. So Ken Robinson has said in one of his TED podcasts, which is very good if you've not seen it before, says that we live in a culture where students are scared of being wrong, which I link to the being continuously assessed, being told that you're a failure if you don't meet the grades that you're needing to. And actually, if you're living in this kind of environment, it's very difficult to do the best that you can, because you're almost worried that you may not meet a level. Now, what we then get is students who rely overly on things like search engines and Google. So I'm talking about, like I said, from a personal perspective, an IT perspective. Our students are too reliant on search engines, and we can do the most amazing lessons, but actually the students will revert to using search engines, and it is quite frustrating, because if they can't find exactly what they're looking for in a search engine, then what they will do is try and find sources that maybe other people have used, or they will struggle to come to conclusions based on, let's say, there's a little bit of what they need on website X, a little bit of what they need on website Y, a little bit what they need on website 10, website Z, and they can't bring it all together. And that's problem solving. taking things that other people have said and being able to read between the lines, not necessarily thinking, oh, well, that's what it says there, so therefore it must be correct, but actually thinking, well, actually, this Ken, let's say for example this Ken Robinson quote that I've got here, you could get somebody reading that thinking, who is this Ken Robinson? What does he know? Why does he think this? What evidence does he have to back this up? Students aren't doing that, and it's quite kind of frustrating. And this is where things like the philosophical inquiry really kind of come in, because actually what we want to do is to get students thinking, to get students to a point whereby they're able to solve problems. Okay, so I'm going to go now on to philosophical inquiry, and I'm going to call it PE from now, because philosophical inquiry itself is I don't think it's one of the best names in the world, but however the actual things that we're going to have a look at are quite interesting, I think. And let's say PE, don't mix it up with physical education, I hope you're not, but ultimately from at this point I'm going to call it PE. Is designed to make students think, discuss, explore ideas, concepts, and so on and so forth. Now there's a lot of stuff available at the minute about philosophy in education, and there's lots of resources out there, and as far as I'm concerned, if you guys want to go and have a look at that later on, you're more than welcome to do that. However, I'm ultimately an IT teacher, I'm not a philosopher, and the actual kind of theories behind it, I'm sure you can get from people much more qualified from about this topic than myself. However, this is more, quite an easy thing that we can do within the classroom to actually get students thinking. It's not amazingly dissimilar to the concept of a thunk. If you haven't come across the thunk before, it's where you give an open-ended statement, answer, something to think about for the student, generally as a starter, and the students will then potentially discuss it. It's one of my preferred starters as a tutor, because I always go, I remember when I started teaching, and I used to do these beautiful starters. It used to take me, I don't know, half of my weekend to prepare this starter, and I would use it maybe in my level 2 classes, so let's say 3 lessons a week, 4 lessons a week, if I had 4 different level 2 classes. And the students would do this activity in about 5 minutes, and you're sitting there thinking, I spent all weekend preparing this thing. And gradually, as you kind of get used to being a tutor, then actually you prepare less and get more out of students. And I think Thunks is a very good example of that. So what you just need is some kind of statement. So let's say, for example, I can say to you, social media has had a positive impact on society, or actually, as it's an IT class that I would usually teach, I would probably say social media has had a negative impact on society, and then get them to discuss. And actually, from my point of view, I have to do very little, but from their point of view, we could probably talk about that for an hour and a half. I mean, you wouldn't, but we could probably talk about that for an hour and a half. And that's actually not amazingly similar to philosophical inquiry. Now, PE will not solve the issues that we've highlighted in the previous slides. A number of those come from the very top. They come from government, they come from Ofsted, and those guys rely on stats. It's what they understand. They don't necessarily understand teaching and learning, and it's going to be something that frustrates us for a long time. But it's not going to change anytime soon, and we've got to deal with it really. However, we can still develop these skills, which the curriculum is, specifically the IT curriculum in my experience is poor at developing. Other subjects may be better or worse at developing thinking skills. I would imagine the real creative subjects like the arts will be quite good at developing things like creativity. But there's still room for this sort of activity. Now you can take this on and you can try it in the classroom. This is certainly something that you would not do every lesson. I think that makes sense. You would not do this every single lesson. It's just too big. You might do it in a tutorial once every 2 or 3 weeks. It's something that you would want to do intermittently. And that would really get the best out of your students. I mean, as at Aylesbury, I was an advanced practitioner for a little while. I've observed a couple of hundred lessons, and it was quite obvious when teachers were doing things that they wouldn't normally do. So let's say, for example, if something like this comes out and the students are sat there going, well, what's the tutor doing now? We've never done this before. Well, that's pretty obvious, as an observer. If a student hasn't done something before, they're going to be sat there with a very confused look on their face. And the students aren't stupid, okay? They're going to be looking at you going, oh, there's an observer in the room, that's why we're doing something different. But anyway, let's move on from there. So what is a philosophical question? So a philosophical question is one which has no set defined answer. However, I think ultimately with these sorts of activities, you need to remember that although the thing as a whole is called philosophical inquiry, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to be like Socrates, okay? You ultimately will make a decision because you know your students as to what type of stimuli is best for your classes, okay? And you have to make a decision that based on the tutor, based on your students. Lots of people think that because it's philosophy, it's got to be very deep and meaningful. Well, actually, no, it doesn't really. I mean, maybe as you get higher up the levels, you could get some very deep and meaningful stuff going on, but ultimately, as a tutor, you make your own decisions on that. I certainly don't tend to do an awful lot, to be brutally honest. So, I mean, let's say, for example, within IT, I could get an article about mobile phone addiction. I mean, actually, I think that's a far bigger issue than just IT, to be honest with you. But get students thinking about their behaviour, because you say to students about mobile phone addiction, and they just assume that they're not addicted to their phone. But when you say to them, can you leave your phone at home for a day? And the answer is no. And you're thinking, well, or even, the students will have their phone out constantly, checking it every, 22 minutes. It seems to feel like, and it's like, well, really, I mean, can you not just, get on with your work or get on with something outside of the phone? Because what's going to happen in your phone in 20 minutes that you can't deal with? It seems utterly crazy, but. I mean, that's a different issue entirely. But there's so much there for that. So if I kind of just show you the article, okay, so this is one from the summer about people who use mobile phones, and I could use this as a stimuli to our learners, and they could read the article and then perform certain actions based on that. So let's go back to the PowerPoint. Okay. So stimuli is used to get learners to think, and ultimately it's down to the tutor. Okay, or maybe, I mean, if you really kind of get this down to a T, you can get learners to bring in their own stimuli. I mean, you get them to send you it the week before, and you can have a look at it to make sure it's suitable, to make sure you kind of have your own ideas on it. But ultimately, because the whole idea with this is to give learners the opinion to form their own questions and to give them the opportunity to give their own ideas, which they don't often have otherwise in college or school. It could be good to give them that opportunity. That's up to you as a tutor, I guess. Your students. We're going to have a quick look at the question quadrant, and just a little example about the type of thing that we could do with that. So news websites such as BBC, or I've got The Guardian here, contain stories which can be used frequently throughout. So again, if I just quickly go back to the BBC one website, and then if I click on text, so this is where I could go to get examples of stimuli, and once I find one thing, I could then use it again to other classes or again in the future. So I mean, just looking at this right now, I could see this article by Tim Berners-Lee. It's actually quite worrying as an IT tutor how few people know people like Tim Berners-Lee, who's the guy who created the World Wide Web. And you've got things like hatred, which is quite prevalent on some social media sites at the minute. There's a lot of stuff out there about being able to monitor what's on the web. That will be a very good stimuli. But again, it does depend on your level of students. So hologram lecturers to teach at university. That would be quite an interesting one about how people think that would work out. Would it be better? I mean, obviously I'm recording this primarily because I am teaching a lot of the time at the minute, so it's easier to do it this way. Does that have more or less impact than somebody who's physically there? Obviously, one of the issues with this is that you can't ask me any questions. I mean, you'll be able to email me afterwards, but it's not quite the same. I think with the P itself, you got to remember that ultimately we are given the opportunity here for the learners to really drive the types of things that you're talking about. So you got to go in there with a reasonably open mind. You've got to be kind of thinking, okay, well, this could go in any direction, really. You may have something in your mind that you'd like to discuss, but actually if your students want to go otherwise, it's their call at the end of the day, But I mean, obviously you're going to have to be able to deal with that, and if it starts going down any unsuitable directions, you're going to have to stop it and switch it. It's one of the risks ultimately, but that's education as a whole. Dealing with class discussions is a bit like that. So question quadrant I mentioned briefly. So this is something that we could potentially give to students and ask them to think about. Let's say we're giving them a stimuli, and then they've got to come up with, I don't know, let's say for example you could have them individually or pair them up and get them to think of one question which goes into each part of this quadrant. So you would have speculative questions, which is it's speculative, you don't know the answer. You got philosophical questions, which is open and general, so that's, it'll be something about bigger than just the stimulus that you're giving the learner. You've got factual questions, which is ones which are more closed, and obviously clarification questions, which is going to be closed and about the stimulus. So it sounds more complex than what it is. We've got an example here. Okay, so we've got the poster with a picture with it's clearly been photoshopped, but I mean, you've got in theory a young kid who is dragging the, I don't actually know the name of that device, but a chair type, I don't know, thing, chariot, that'll do. And then you've got all of these other potential questions here. So you've got, how old is the little boy? It's a speculative question, you don't know. You would probably say 8, 9, 10, whatever. But it's speculative, but it's about the stimulus. The closed question, what material did the artist use? Okay, so you could say, actually that's a little bit vague, to be pretty honest with you, but you could say, for example, if it was Photoshop, you could talk about that, or you could talk about it as a painting, whatever. Philosophical questions, open, and it's more than just the stimulus. So there you've got, should children work for money? So you're making an assumption actually that this child is earning money. The fact that it's a black and white photograph, you assume that it's quite an old photo. You assume that because it's a black and white and old photo that it might be from the turn of the century, and so on. And this is the type of thing that you might well discuss as part of your class. Now obviously you would have something that's more relevant to your class, so that there's going to be more to talk about. It's entirely up to you, but this is just an example. So what I would do from here is, if you got these 4 questions from, let's say for example, a pair, you could then join them up with another pair, and then you compare the questions that you've got, and you redo the questions very slightly. You choose which one that you prefer. So rather than how old is the little boy, you could have what country is it based in? I don't know. And then you could potentially, as a pair, discuss the question and think about which one you prefer, and then as a 4 you go forward with the 4 questions, or maybe just pick one, whichever one is their favourite, and then you could have all these questions up on the board. As a class, you could potentially vote for your favourite one, or the one you're most interested in, and then you could have a discussion about that one as a class, for example, or you could pick, I don't know, one from each one of these boxes. All right, there's lots of different things that you could potentially do here, and ultimately how you do it is up to you. So I've got other things here, such as you could potentially, in their pairs, for each one of those 4 questions, put some thoughts and discussions on the discussion forum on the VLE, or you could do a podcast. There's lots of different things that you could potentially do there. You could do a newsletter, leaflet, whatever. But the idea here is not so much about the question itself, it's the whole process of the students thinking. Okay, we're getting the students to actually think about stuff and not just revert to Google. They're kind of justifying their reasons. They're thinking, actually, does this make sense? And then other people are coming up with ideas which are different to what they've come up with, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh, actually, that might be a good idea. What do you think about that? And it's just this whole kind of process. We don't do enough of it within FE as a whole, and in education as a whole, really. So it's quite a nice thing to do, and there's lots of different things, like I said, that we could do, and I'm not going to go through every single one of them here, because ultimately there's way too many. I'm just looking at the actual kind of idea as a whole of what we're doing. You would obviously look to wrap it up. So a plenary, as you would do in a normal class. So I've got post-it notes. What are your thoughts? You could do another question, I guess, what else would you like to know? You could do a what have you learned? You could do any number of different things. It's a standard normal plenary, but you would want to end it in some way. The inquiry itself can be as long or short as the tutor likes. I think that's an important thing, but as you can see, it's probably not something that's going to be a 5-minute job. It's not a starter, okay, whereas a funk is a starter, whereas this is more of a full lesson. And I know that when we did a trip to West Bedfordshire College, is that the one? It's the college in Dunstable, and they've used this sort of technique for a lot, and they were very, very keen on it, and they basically said that they believed that this sort of technique got them their grade 2. Sorry, Central Bedfordshire College. For some reason I had West Midlands Safari Park in my head. This is what happens when you get old. But you had Central Beds who basically said to us on our trip that they thought that using this sorts of activity was the reason why Ofsted gave them the grade 2, which was a very powerful message. Now I can't see using it in every lesson. I think it would be very difficult to do, but obviously, things, especially in tutorial, it'd be great in tutorial. It would be nice, every once in a while within your classes to do this sort of thing. But actually, if you're going to get the most out of it, you need to run it multiple times. The students need to get used to doing this. If you're only going to do it when an observer comes in, which, as an observer in the past, the amount of times, like I said, you see people doing stuff just for the observed lesson that you would never do previously, it's pretty obvious. Ultimately, that you do need to run it multiple times. So I've got what skills here now. I think that actually I've probably under-egged this, but there is, like I said, there's lots of research out there, and there are lots of different resources out there which will discuss this in more depth, and it'll give you more in-depth reasoning for it. So we want students to develop critical, creative and reasoning skills. You'll notice these are all actually the higher level skills within our vocational courses. Okay, these are all distinction criteria words that we're looking at here. We're looking at the ability to reflect. Some of my students cannot reflect. It's a really key thing to do in life as a whole, to be able to look back and go, well, actually I would do this differently, and the reason why I'll do it differently is whatever. You want to be able to say, I could potentially improve what I have done by doing X, Y, Z, and the impact that will have on my product is whatever. Okay, we want students to be doing that, and they need to be knowing that actually if they get it wrong the first time around, it's not the end of the world. We get things wrong all the time. I get things wrong all the time. This is about my 5th take on doing this video, and it's something which you just deal with really in life, but it's something which I think students struggle to deal with because they've been assessed all the time up to this point in their life. Problem solving, I say it's a very big thing really. If you are saying there is an issue with this, I can't find the answer, what can I do to find the answer? Not just Googling it. Okay, they need to be able to look elsewhere, they need to think outside of the box. Okay, and I think these are very important skills, for them to have. So I've come to the end of my little introduction to this. I mean, like I said, there's loads and loads and loads of resources out there. One of the initial companies that actually helped set this up is a company called SAFRE, which is the Society for Advancement of Philosophical Inquiry and Reflection in Education, which is a bit of a mad name, frankly. But it has got some really good stuff. Okay, so let's say, for example, you can go to resources, and I go to Key Stage 4 because that's predominantly where I teach, and it gives you loads of different stuff that you can actually do. And my thing naturally is going to take ages. You've got lots of different things that you can look at here. Gollum. You can have a look at that stuff to your heart's content. But I mean, really, there's lots of different stuff. There's this we are Creative Innovation Supportive website up there. They've got quite a nice PDF which you can read up on, which is all about philosophical inquiry. You might recognise the quadrant which I've shamelessly stolen from this PDF. And you can have a look at that. It's quite interesting. But there's so much different stuff out there when it comes to philosophy for schools. It's not just this site. This is just one that I've picked out because this is who we were involved with at Aylesbury. A gentleman called Nick Chandler, who's very interesting. Very knowledgeable on the subject. Lots of really nice examples. And like I said, it's obviously not something that we can do week in, week out, but it is something which, if we could implement to some of our lessons, I think it would have a bit of an impact. So again, just let's say thank you very much for watching. Give it a shot, see how it goes, and if you want to try stuff out, don't be afraid to do stuff differently. It's got to suit your class, it's got to suit you, it's got to suit your class. And if you do that, hopefully it'll work well. But thank you very much for watching, and good luck.